Hello and welcome back to OT, the podcast. We're here to talk about watches, time, how to spend it. My name is Andy Green, and with me,
Felix Schultz. Andy, do you deliberately do your introductions super straight because I'm like super all over the shop in mine?
I think people enjoy the contrast.
Yeah, okay.
If you guys have a favourite, let us know. Join our Discord. We have a favourite joining us today, Felix. Favourite of yours,
all our
mine.
guests' favourites, Andy.
But if there was like a favourite group within the favourites, so like cream at the top, that
Let
you
me
skim
put it
off.
this way. Today's guest is my first guest, my favourite guest that we've had on named Anthony.
Oh, we better check that. I don't know.
Top three.
Top three Anthonys.
We haven't had. I'm calling it favourite Anthony.
Favourite Anthony.
Yep.
Anthony Traina, who you might know as Tony Traina.
Sure.
Or Rescapement.
Yes.
From places like Rescapement.
And Hodinkee.
Yeah, amongst others. Full-time Hodinkee now.
Yeah.
Or maybe he litigated against you or for you on your behalf at some point during his legal career.
Chicago-based lawyer at some point in the past.
Yeah, no judgment here. So, yes, Anthony Traina, Tony Traina, is joining us to chat about his take on watches, his watch journey. He had the really cool exclusive on the new Rolex Deep Sea Challenge, 12,000 million meters. So he flew out to the factory and has a really kind of cool original take. I've not seen it, but he really broke that news.
That would have been like probably his first big press trip. Just imagine like going, oh yeah, I've got this job at Hodinkee, not sure what it's going to be like. Then getting on a plane to Switzerland and being shown a 50 millimeter titanium Rolex and having to like be professional about that.
Yeah, and I mean, within the first month of working there, I think he said, and yeah, exactly, like a Rolex is an interesting brand to, kind of work within that capacity, but very cool experience. And what a great guy, Felix. But before we talk to Anthony, we've actually done some interesting stuff this week.
Yeah, we got on the road. We were on the road last week. We had a little soiree up to Sydney, New York City, Sydney.
Laszlo Schultz. We did OT Roadshow. It was basically like a little mini watches and wonders with a little bit less wonder, a bit more watches.
We went up. First thing we did, we saw Ulyssnada. We had they're now looked after by the Hourglass in Australia, and we had the opportunity to see some kind of cool pieces and to meet the sort of the brand, the new brand people, and have some nice lunch. Reynold from MasterChef's restaurant. That was cool. What did you think?
Famous for his desserts. Really cool. Nice little crowd. A few big kind of watch personalities from the Australian scene there. Champs from Instagram, if you've seen him. Watch Advice. Hao Ming, very talented photographer, and then somehow we made the cut for the event. Very cool pieces. There was some pretty freaky watches there.
The one I liked, I'm really sorry I can't remember its name. There was three of them. There's three of them made, and it's a diamond encrusted fully set blast. But the thing about its setting was that there was some stupendous number of different cuts of the stones because they took for inspiration a shattered mirror, and then they just replicated that sort of look of like all the lines of fracture just in diamonds. So they didn't just pave set it, they didn't baguette set it, they sort of customized the entire fully set case to look like a broken mirror. And it was a pretty impressive piece of watch.
It was well gem set. It was really kind of quite beautiful. Brand we don't hear enough of, but if you're in Australia, I think you can head down to the Hourglass and check it out, right?
Yeah. Or you can look at Andy took some beautiful shots. I think you've put them on your own Instagram.
Yeah, on Insta somewhere. We'll post them to OT as well.
Yeah,
post them to our Instagram. Post them in our Discord. We'll throw them around.
Yes.
So we moved on. We saw some other brands while we were in there, but we were up there also for a very big Cartier event. And big is a bit of a understatement, I think.
The opening of the Southeast Asia Oceania flagship store, which is, if you're familiar with Sydney, where the Apple store is in Sydney, there's LV on the other corner. The third corner is now Cartier. So just up the road from, the boutiques of Hublot and JLC and Panerai and RWC and, all these other guys sort of along that little strip. What a shop, Andy. What a shop.
Yeah, the whole story just stunning. One of the most luxurious uh, destinations I think I've ever been in.
Yeah, and a lot of the things that I think are really impressive about it is that they've enlisted, like, it's the design, of course, it's a Cartier boutique. It has to be, up to sort of international standards. So they've, designed it out of France, but not only is I think like 90% of the materials have been sourced locally, which is sort of part of Cartier's sustainability efforts. Also, they've got a lot of like local artisans and talent to sort of add in elements like some of the light fittings and some sort of
Mm.
really impressive like woven elements and marquetry and all this sort of phenomenal stuff. It's really worth a trip if you're in Sydney.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be lines for the next few weeks, but really highly in demand. Pretty cool. There was also a surprise appearance by Labyrinth, the UK artist who they flew out just for the event, who impressively performed like 10 songs.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That was a big after party as well. If we had a quick look around the boutique. They whisked us away to an undisclosed location, and which I think was just up the road. I can't remember what else. And yeah, had a good night. Great
Had a
time all
lovely
around.
night. Had a lovely night. The following day, he got to see a watch I'd not seen in person before, the Chevard Alpine Eagle.
What did you think?
I'm pretty into it. I quite like it. I don't think I was a massive fan
Okay.
when it first came out, but I
Yep.
think it come out in like a chrono originally when they re-released it,
Uh,
or really big. It was a big
big,
boy.
big,
Yeah,
big chrono and time only.
yeah, that's right. And then they've sort of done a more, I guess, mid-size, but a more wearable size watch for me anyway.
And what did you think about the dial, which is inspired by the iris of an eagle?
I've not gotten close enough to the iris of an eagle to make a kind of fair comparison, but it's really
Okay.
beautiful. It is actually, that was a watch that surprised me, delighted me a little bit. I'm
Sure.
impressed. I'm impressed by it. I quite like it. I'm quite a fan of the Alpine Eagle. I think it's pretty cool. I like the size. I like they had some precious metal, they had steel. I mean they're expensive watches, but most luxury watches are getting
Yep.
pretty expensive these days. But I really like it. I would wear one.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting things to say about Chopard, and I think they're kind of a slept-on brand still.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, some of their broader collection, and again, a really a small boutique when we're comparing it to Cartier, obviously, but really nice boutique, really lovely.
Everything's a small boutique compared to Cartier. I've been in Coles that are smaller than that.
Yeah, you're not wrong. Anyway, enough about our Sydney adventures, Felix.
Do you know what I forgot to take up with me?
What did you forget to take up?
Artem straps.
You silly duffer.
I went with suede, and did I regret it in the sudden rain? I did. If I'd been rocking a loopless or a NATO strap, I wouldn't have had to worry about inclement weather at all. I could have just kept on keeping calm and carrying on, except with suede, I had to like cover my wrist, like, I don't know, Jerry Seinfeld in a suede jacket, and just, I was stressed.
It was a liability, and really you should have had an asset on your wrist. Maybe a sailcloth from Artem Straps, artem.straps on Instagram or artemstraps.com.au.
Yeah, don't stress out about your strap. Get an Artem strap. Look at that. How's that for a tagline?
You should be a writer. You should talk less and write more.
Hey, speaking of talking more and writing less, as I believe is what you said, this week's episode, Andy, is much like the last three, sponsored by G-Shock Australia. You can check them out at gshock.com.au. We've been talking about G-Shock for the last little while now, from its origins in the 1980s until today. So this is the last installment in our series, and I want to ask a question, Andy. What's excited you about G-Shock in the last few years?
I mean, Felix, it's probably the brand. It definitely is the brand I've bought the most of in the last few years. I think I've half a dozen acquisitions at least. Definitely during like the peak of the pandemic, I was buying a couple of fun G-Shocks. So there's been a bit, but I think for me personally, the Casio. It was 2019 when Casio released the GA 2100 series, nicknamed the Casio by probably someone on the Scottish Watches Facebook, pointing fingers at Ricky, perhaps.
No, it's there's a we'll link it up in show notes. A Hodinkee article that actually name checks the guy, so it was literally someone that came up with it, and it stuck.
Done. Well, Nice work. Obviously, the luxury sports connection is a really kind of happy accident with this watch. But you know what I love, Felix?
What?
Casio leaned into that, and not that long ago, they did
Mhm.
a full metal Casio, if you will.
Have you? Have you? Are you getting one of these, Andy?
Yeah. So I got my well, maybe one day future brother-in-law one.
Whoa.
Bit of a birthday present, dropping
Yeah.
some bombs. He's a big watch guy, and I had a feeling he would love it. So I think this is the, if I pull up the reference, the GMB 2100 series.
Nice.
And it's effectively, I mean, the big thing with the Casio was everyone was modding them, right? So it was
Yep.
plastic and they just chuck it in an aftermarket case. Well, Casio decided to do that for you. They took away the work for anyone who couldn't be bothered and released a really nicely done, kind of full metal GA 2100.
I've just not to discredit the joys of the unmodded full metal Casio. We haven't maybe quite discussed how important the Casio is for the story of OT the podcast as well. Because
Oh,
obviously
yeah.
we've got the Anodyne limited edition, but it's not the first watch we customized or made for OT essentially.
You know, I think, yeah, the dial artist, our first ever guest, our first ever episode interviewee, if you will.
You should get him back on.
We should get him back on with better audio quality,
Unofficial.
Chris. But he probably played a reasonably big part in the success of that watch. Not to take anything away from Casio,
100%.
but he was big on the customization. Obviously,
Yep.
did stuff to the dial. We got them. We got a couple made for us to really celebrate the launch.
For Swifty that helped us
Swifty.
out with the technical side early on.
Love Swifty. Yeah, and we got some lovely customized pieces, kind of tailored to each of our personalities. And I think that was the really big thing with that watch and why it was so important. And it was really timed quite nicely.
Yep.
But obviously, yeah, they've leaned into it, which is really unusual for a brand to just kind of say, "Oh, you guys are sort of playing around here. We can do this better, and we can do it to the quality that it really deserves to be done to."
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. But there's more. It's not just Casio. Obviously, we're talking about this for the 40th anniversary. That's going to be mostly celebrated next year. But they've got in early. There's a few sneak 40th anniversary pieces that have crossed our inbox, and the first is one that I am so very ready for. It's
Mm-hmm.
called the Red Flare models. I'm going to say the references: MTG B3000 FR and GWG 2040 FR. There's a picture in front of you, Andy. What do you think of what you're looking at?
Bold, and quite fun, quite interesting, quite intense. What do you think?
Sort of insane, sort
Yeah,
of awesome.
kind of looks like it belongs in a Marvel film.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this sounds it sounds incredible, but it's also very on trend. Weirdly enough, so the bezels of these models have been made of laminated carbon and glass fiber sheets interspersed with luminous materials, and they're in sort of a red and yellow color scheme, designed to evoke the look of a solar flare. The dial details obviously match, so a lot of bright orange going on. They glow in the dark as well.
Oh wow, that is fun.
Some of the case elements on the GWG also glow in the dark. It's wild and very much up my alley.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It just stands out, and it sort of leans that into that other side of what Casio G-Shock are so famous for.
Yeah,
which is fun, toughness, all that sort of stuff.
yeah, and I think so. The other one that we've seen so far does that as well, but in a very more restrained way. This is the 40th anniversary Eric Hayes collaboration, GMWB 5000EH, which is made in partnership with a guy named Eric Hayes, who's been a frequent collaborator with G-Shock since 1999. He's a designer and graphic artist who worked with like Keith Haring and Basquiat in the 80s. So he's a big deal. This is based on the OG G-Shock, so that iconic one. It's in steel. It's on a black IP steel bracelet. But the cool thing about the bracelet is that it's been sort of printed or worked to have like a Hayes artwork on it, which is, I think, kind of cool. Like, why don't we see more people doing stuff like that on bracelets?
Yeah, it's like a fun texture to it. I mean, Casio are potentially the original, one of the original watch brand collaborators.
Yeah,
You know,
100%. Oh, and also there's when you turn the little backlight on, the screen you can't see it normally, but the screen has like his signature, which I
oh,
think
that's
is cool.
cool.
So yeah, for me, this sort of sums up everything that makes G-Shock, G-Shock, like design, style, streetwear, all in a unkillable, super tough package.
Collaboration. I mean, the first G Shocks I ever got were like skateboarder collaborations
Oh, sick.
from
Mate, you
the
had
early
collabs
2000s.
with
Yeah, it
Wow.
was
Well, of course you did.
naturally when I had that phase of my life. Felix,
Well,
if I learned anything from the last, 3-4 episodes talking about the last 40 years of G Shock, it is that the future is looking as good as the past. And I think everyone should head to gshock.com.au to check out, the collection. Christmas is around the corner. We're literally 5-6 weeks out. Support gshock.com.au, G-Shock Australia, who support OT because they're part of the reason we're here today. Still chatting.
good
Felix,
point.
before we get this guest on, before we
Mm,
get Mr. Tony on, I did have
okay.
something else I wanted to bring up.
What?
I'm
Performance
leaving OT. No, I want to talk about something I watched today. I watched some Watch YouTube.
Oh, really?
And it's relevant. It's relevant
Okay.
now. And we've not plugged our Discord enough. So in our Discord, we love the Hot Takes channel.
Sure.
It's probably the reason people are in there for a bit of unbridled honesty. We have, I'm sure you know Watch Gringa on Instagram.
Yes.
Yes. I think they've done a bit of a rebrand, but Britt Pierce on YouTube. Don't know if you knew about that, but her channel is like 50% hot takes. I've not really explored her YouTube channel in the last couple of months, I'll be honest. I'm sorry if you're listening. But her last video she published, Watches are not assets, let me explain. Clickbaity, maybe. But it's not. It was really solid. The thumbnail is Horology is Dead. And it was quite a really charming video with some really nice editing. It starts with a bit of a monologue from Waco talking somewhere, and then all of these other things sort of come in to tell a bit of a story. I think it was like a 30-minute video that I was hooked on my little lunch break today.
Well, send me the link. I'll put it in show notes, and we can discuss in Discord.
I think we need to get Britt Pierce on.
Oh,
We're
mate.
going to have a hot takeoff. Hot ones.
Well, we can't have her on today because we've got Tony.
Yes.
Tony Traina.
Future guest. We'll have to do it. All right. Without further ado. To many, today's guest is famous for his love of vintage quirk and wildly popular newsletter. He recently gave up his law career to join Hodinkee as a full-time editor. Please welcome the man formerly known as Rescapement to OT, Tony Traina. Welcome.
Wow, Andy, thanks so much for that intro. That's as kind as anything anyone has ever said about me. Famous is probably not a word that has preceded my name before, but I'm excited to be joining the sort of smash hit that is the OT podcast.
Well, it starts somewhere, and I'm glad to be the person to start it. You've come a long way since your newsletter, but that's now been retired. It is the reason I think that you probably ended up at Hodinkee. It got you a lot of attention. Before we get into the newsletter, before we get into Hodinkee, how did you get into watches?
Yeah, I didn't grow up around watches really. I fell into them initially when I was looking for a nice watch when I was getting married a few years ago now. And I kind of stumbled through all the direct to consumer Instagram type brands that you probably know and love, just like I do. And then at some point I discovered Nomos and their website. I can't remember how for the life of me. But if I could, it probably would have saved me a lot of heartache and a career change. But I discovered them, and something about the design and the presentation was different. And on top of that, it was a $2,000 watch, not a $200 watch. And I was like taken aback by how something could cost so much more than all these other watches that I'd been seeing on the internet. And uh, eventually, I kind of started learning about movements and all of that type of stuff. Went around here in Chicago and even saw one in person. And I remember flipping it over and seeing the exhibition case back that they had on it. And you kind of see the movement. And even on a Nomos for $2,000, they get a pretty decent level of finishing on it. For my eye at the time, at least. And I kind of just was taken aback from there. The design, and then you can learn all of these things about movements. And there's this entire little world and industry that kind of that movement represents. And I fell into it from there. Eventually bought a Nomos Tangente for my wedding. And shortly after that, I kind of fell into the vintage world, and it's taken off from there.
Yeah, that's great. Nomos Tangente. Do you still wear it?
You know what? It's funny. I Sold it because I know it's tragic, right? But,
But where
you
did
know,
watch?
well, listen, here's the thing, Felix. I got married in it, and for a little bit of time after that, I was like, well, I only need one watch. And I was kind of like, well, this watch is a little too dressy. I can't remember, but it didn't have a ton of water resistance. It was only on a strap and all of that type of stuff. So I was like, I really only need one watch. And I sold it for something else. And then I sold it for something else after that. Eventually, I got a Rolex Explorer, a 14270, the 1990s one, and that was kind of my watch for a while before I fell into the trap of realizing that I could own multiple watches. And that's when kind of I really fell into watches hardcore, maybe a year or so after that Tangente. But listen, I mean, I guess I wish I still had the watch or wouldn't have sold it, but it's also good to not sort of be too attached to objects, I suppose. At the end of the day, they're just objects, and I'm still happily married and all of that type of stuff. It doesn't mean any less because I don't have the watch I was wearing
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that wedding
yeah.
day. So
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
still got the memories, guys. Don't worry.
No, but that's like the cardinal sin of watch guys. It's like you got to mark the special moments. Can I just impromptu pitch you a really great Hodinkee story idea?
Sure.
You need some work, Felix.
I'll write it. If it's good, yeah. I mean, as long as I can steal it, if
Find the
it's
watch. No,
good.
it's for you. It's not for me. I can't write it.
Okay.
Find the watch. Find it again. Buy it back. See where it's been.
It's funny, like people have told stories like that, right? On Hodinkee too. I think the one I remember the most is Alton Brown, who his dad's maybe Omega Chronostop got stolen, and years later he tracked it down on eBay after it passed a bunch of hands. So it would be fun to do that one day. So yes, it's something I've certainly thought about. I don't know, it's more of a personal journey than something I would perhaps broadcast, but it's something I've thought about, Felix. So you're on the right track there.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh, you know what, guys? Before we get back to me, we could talk about me for the next 45 minutes or whatever. But I just want to say that I don't listen to a ton of watch podcasts, and you guys are sort of one of them. And I think a lot of people got really into watches over the pandemic, and you guys are one of the consistent voices that I've listened to. I can't remember if you guys started right before or right after the pandemic, but something I look forward to every week. And you guys have this sort of beautiful, laid back Australian banter that's like much needed in the watch industry. And, I appreciate that. And I will also say, you did your collab with Anerdane last year, and I ran into Lewis Heath in New York a couple weeks
Oh,
ago.
nice.
And I asked him, I said, why in the world did you guys collab with that little
We asked him
podcast
too.
down in Australia? I didn't say it that pejoratively, but like kind of, that was the implication. He was like, you know what? I just like those guys. I just remember sort of driving around the countryside of Scotland to work in the morning, and I'd put those guys on, and I loved the banter between Felix and Andy, and it was well said, and I totally agree with it. So don't take it from me, take it from Lewis and Anerdane.
Sure. I mean, look, we really specialize in having our listeners. Like, we might not be as big as Hodinkee, in terms of the podcast, but we like to only appeal to watch journalists and brand managers. That's our target audience.
Sure, yeah,
It's a
all
long way
12 of us, yeah.
That's what
Very
we're here
kind words,
for.
so thank you.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. That's very nice of you, and nice to hear. And it's sort of, we did start on the eve of the pandemic, and it's one of those things where you talk about our podcast being consistent to you. Your newsletter, Rescapement, was really something that we both read. I think Felix was on it very, very early. He's probably one of your first 100 subscribers. He's such a fan, and he swiftly sent it over to me. Obviously, you kind of retired it as you went into focus on Hodinkee full time as sort of a role, and it was something that you were doing whilst you were sort of working in your legal career. At what point did you kind of realize the momentum that your newsletter was getting?
So Hodinkee reached out to me probably earlier this year about the opportunity to go full time, and that's probably the first time I ever thought about it as an actual full time career. I would say, kind of like you guys, Rescapement, the newsletter, I really started to dedicate a lot of time to it as the pandemic came to be. So early 2020. And shortly after that, I started getting people reaching out to me from Collected Man and Hodinkee about freelance opportunities. So that was kind of the first proof I had from actual institutions in the industry or other established publications that I might be onto something, or I might have something unique to say with people like that reaching out to me. But I still never really thought about it as a full-time career until Hodinkee approached me with the opportunity. I thought that I kind of did have something with Rescapement, but it's still relatively small. It's still a newsletter. As much as I believe in sort of the promise of newsletters and podcasts as well as kind of similar mediums that are more personal than a lot of other things nowadays, it's something that grows slowly because of the nature of it, and a lot of it is kind of by word of mouth and people telling people and that type of stuff. So I thought maybe years down the road it could have been something that could have supported me. I had started to commercialize it as well at the beginning of 2022, which is kind of a goal I had set out for myself after using the previous few years to do some freelance work and just kind of build an audience. So it was rewarding that I was able to kind of make money as an actual writer, but it was still relatively small compared to what I was doing as an attorney. So there was some proof to me that it could be a money-making endeavor, but it was years down the road that I would have thought of it as being a full-time thing until Hodinkee reached out to me, and I thought of that as kind of the actual way to switch to a full-time career in watches.
Yeah, right. So you have essentially gone into the dream job for a lot of watch fans. Working at Hodinkee, you've been in the role a couple of months now.
That's about right. I started at the beginning of September, and we are speaking to kind of break the fourth wall, or however many walls there are. We're speaking in mid-November. Yeah, break them all. Sure.
Well, yeah. So you've been there for a few months. What's it like? Is it everything you had hoped and dreamed it would be, or is it just a lot of churn and grind and typos?
Are you catching a lot of typos in my writing, Felix? I'll have to send to you for some copy edits. Yeah, I mean, it is a grind, right? Staying in the day-to-day of watch news and watch media. There's press releases and auctions and things happening every day. The first month was pretty slow. September is kind of when the watch industry, especially in Europe, I think is coming back from their summer vacations, and there's not much happening. But October, November, there were a bunch of releases I covered. I went to Rolex for the first time to cover that big ass deep sea, and was able to visit their facility in Geneva at least, and traveled to New York for Hodinkee. And then there was auction coverage. I didn't go to the auctions this time around, but I did some coverage for them. And it's kind of been nonstop ever since. I got about a month to get my footing, and then it's been kind of go. So it's a lot, but I love it. I mean, I'm not working any less than I was as an attorney at a law firm, I wouldn't say, but I like it a lot more. And it's part of it is my own fault too. Like, watches were my hobby for the past few years, or more than that. Writing about watches was my hobby for the past few years. So it's difficult for me to kind of flip the switch now, because watches used to be what I would think about on nights and weekends, and I would have a day job that I would do during the day. But now I think about watches all day long, and I need to figure out a way to turn that off. It's difficult for me now because I still love them, but I do need to like give myself space sometimes. So it's a lot. It's a lot to keep up with, but it's been a lot of fun so far, and I love being able to take time out of my day to write about watches, think about watches, and do stuff like this too, where I can just talk to fellow enthusiasts. Like, I was at Oak and Oscar is a local brand here in Chicago that I love. You guys have had Chase on actually before,
Yes.
Who's a great guy. And he had his owners weekend here in Chicago, and a bunch of local owners and people even from around the country came in to hang out with other watch enthusiasts for a weekend. And he had a few events, and, I was talking to doctors and other people that owned his watches. And it was a great reminder that these guys and gals are not around enthusiastic watch people on a day-to-day basis like I am. And it's a great reminder not to sort of take for granted that I get to do this on a day-to-day basis, when for most people it's something they do on late nights or weekends after their kids go to sleep or something like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What I'm curious to know is sort of that just a little bit more on that jump of going, like a legal career. Like, it's a big deal. You've studied years and years and years, lots of effort. Like, at what point did you know you kind of had to do it, or that this was the best decision for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it was harder than I thought it would be, maybe, to leave my legal career behind. I mean, I had worked as an attorney for 4 years, and then here in the US, it's 3 years of post-college study to become an attorney. So that's 7 years of my life dedicated to becoming an attorney. And I was pretty comfortable in my job, and I knew what the future would look like if I continued to be an attorney. But I kind of knew if I didn't make the jump to being a full-time writer or going full-time at Hodinkee. It's something I would always wonder about if I didn't take the opportunity, because like you mentioned, right, it is a dream job for a lot of people in a way to write about watches, sure, but to do something, to make a full-time job out of something that you're passionate or enthusiastic about, like not everyone gets that opportunity. So sure, being an attorney is great and pays well and all of that type of stuff. And it's comfortable, and there's not a lot of volatility in it, but not a lot of people get the opportunity to work for a place like Hodinkee, or do something that they just love. So I always knew that when I thought about it that way, I kind of knew I had to, and I would regret it, not for the rest of my life. I mean, it's not that dramatic, but I would always wonder sort of what would have happened if I had taken the opportunity, and I didn't. And I always thought too, like, listen, if it goes horribly wrong and I crash and burn and I'm a terrible full-time writer, I could always go back to being an attorney. I mean, it's not that hard, I don't think, as long as I kind of figure it out quickly. So on a more practical level, I always had that in the back of my mind too. But, a few months in at least, and going back has not crossed my mind once.
And I guess that's sort of interesting. It's sort of it's a safety net, but it's not, because you're sort of still dipping out. And are you happy with the decision?
Yeah, overall, I'm happy with the decision. I'm happy with the decision.
Do you have any advice? I mean, I know you've spoken about sort of your process there, but like, I don't know about you. I get a lot of sort of people asking me in DMs and stuff about, hey, how do I get into this? I really love this. Some of one of I think someone we both know, Nick Kenyon, from Australia. He started his career in watches, I guess, at a retailer, but he got into writing, and just after hassling me a lot, and I'm like, I gave him a lot of time, bizarrely. Do you have any advice about someone considering making that jump? It doesn't have to be watches, but into
Any
something
career
they're
change
passionate about. Career change.
Yeah, I'm curious what you say, Felix, actually, too. I mean, it's kind of two parts, right? You asked how to get into watches, and then how to think about making the jump. I think I'm not sure if I got into watches the right way. Because it took a few years for me to kind of get the attention of the Hodinkees and A Collected Mans of the world, and for them to care about what I was doing. I just kind of started a website and a newsletter, and I had probably less than 50 people reading it the first time I sent one out. And I'm not sure that's the most efficient way, right? I mean, it slowly built up to, thousands, millions of subscribers. But I'm not sure that was the most efficient way to go about it. I never did the thing where I was cold emailing these publications, asking them or pitching them ideas, or tagging other quote unquote influential people to try to get them to read my shit on Instagram. I never really did any of that. I kind of just put stuff up and hoped that the right people would stumble across it, and eventually did. But it took time. And I think on one level, it's kind of my personality that way. So it's reflective of my personality. I'm pretty introverted and all of that type of stuff. And I don't have a big look at me personality. It's kind of the US Midwesterner in me, I suppose. But I would recommend that to some people in a way, because no one's going to give you a chance unless you have a body of work to show them that you actually write or take good photographs or whatever it is. But at the same time, like, you do need to make an effort to reach out and meet people and meet the managing editors at these publications. Because the more I'm in it, the more I realize how old fashioned the industry still is in a way, and that it's a who business and all of that type of stuff. And I didn't, I'm out here in Chicago, which is a long way from Geneva and Switzerland, and I didn't have an appreciation for that, nor did I necessarily care, nor do I still care on some level about who's doing what and who's getting invites to what press events and all of that type of stuff. I'm kind of just love watches and want to write about them and wear them and all of that type of stuff. So I'm more of an enthusiast than a pure journalist in that way. But if you want to do this full time, you do need to meet people at some point. And it's not necessarily the PR people at brands and all of that type of stuff, but meeting collectors and, people at heritage departments of brands and stuff like that, that actually have, interesting things to say. And I wish I would have done more of that sooner.
Yeah, I guess, speaking about what you said, what do I say in these situations? I'm really I sort of came into it in a similar way to you, like a very slow start, and I did it as a side hustle for for years. I'm really glad I did it like that, because if I went into it, you know, as Felix Schultz, guy that loves watches, to Felix Schultz, guy that works for watches, overnight, essentially, I couldn't have sustained it. I would have been too. I think the reality of the watch industry would have killed the passion too quickly for me.
Tony answered the question though without realizing he answered the question. That's just, it's hard work and patience
Yeah,
and
yeah,
building your own influence, right? Because that's the thing is, you didn't know anyone influential. By the time Hodinkee hired you, I don't know how many people you had subscribed to the newsletter, but I'd say tens and tens of thousands.
millions. He said millions.
Millions.
That's
Millions.
right. Yeah.
You had
Yeah,
millions?
just like this podcast. Yeah, just like this
Possibly
podcast.
billions.
There you go. Well, a fraction of this podcast, but you became influential, and you actually stood out, so that when the time came to, talk to these publications, they said, yeah, well, we know who he is, and he's got that body of work, but you're more of a known quantity, and you had that established voice and personality already, so you kind of created it yourself. And I would say, that's the right way to go about most things, like patience and hard work.
Yeah. The other thing I would say, sorry, Felix, I interrupted you. Go ahead if you'd like.
No. It's you're the star.
Watches of Espionage is kind of one of those social media accounts that has taken the world by storm over the past year, however long it's been. And I talked to him recently as he was standing up a newsletter, but he did it in a really smart way where he built up a really massive and engaged social media following before he invested in a newsletter and merch and all of that type of stuff. And I wish I would have done that as well and tried to figure out your niche and find your people on, big platforms like social media or TikTok or whatever else before investing in. I would write these great articles when I had 50 or 100 or even 1,000 subscribers. And it's just the payoff probably was not worth it. And I wish I would have kind of leveraged some of the social media stuff to build a following before I actually invested a lot of time in writing.
You're living in the payoff now, though. That's the thing. You're living in the payoff. So it's sort of at the time, you can't expect it to pay instantly. And you'd be talking to a wall for, could be a couple of years before, it gets noticed. And all of a sudden you're working at Hodinkee.
That's true. There's some truth to that for sure.
I would 100% say, as someone that's sort of, been doing it, on that other side for a while, it's a really small world and everyone notices if someone talented emerges. Like it's very quick, and I think everyone's interested in what those people are doing. Like there's Watches of Espionage is a great example. Like I'm sure that they have had every single, managing editor or key decision maker of some brand like slide into their DMs going, hey, what are you doing? What's the go? Like that's
Espionage. That's what he's doing. Espionage.
I can't tell you about it. Yeah.
Is this your alter ego? Are you? It's been created to infiltrate the watch industry.
No, I think I think it's a small industry and people are hungry for new things. And
it gets dry.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And then, the new things become the old things and the cycle starts over again. It's never ending.
Speaking of old things, bit of a segue into one of your stories that I read recently, because I was doing some research like the professional that I am. $1 million watches. What a roller coaster.
You're talking about the article I wrote for Hodinkee?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I'll give the listeners some background who aren't well versed in my my discography, if you will. But I wrote a kind of an in-depth piece before the auction season this year about $1 million watches at auction. And, I became fascinated about them when I was reading the book by Stacy Perman. It's called A Grand Complication, I think it's called. I can't remember. But it's kind of it's about, kind of the battle to get the world's most complicated watch between Packard and Graves, kind of two great Patek collectors from the 20s or 30s. But I was more interested in kind of the history of the auction world that she tells in the meantime in the process, and of the 90s and 2000s and beyond. But the first time a watch sold for $1 million at auction was only I can't remember if it was 1994 or 1996. So it's not that long ago that these watches were selling for, or have been selling for, 7 figures. And, you know, back in the day, it was kind of complicated Pateks that you'd find at Antiquorum that would start to hit that $1 million mark. But I think kind of what's been fascinating to me over the past few years is just the growth in other brands and other types of watches that are starting to hit the $1 million mark, as well as some of the Pateks that have fallen off because they're just I shouldn't say we, because I'm not here collecting $1 million watches, but sort of the prolific collectors of the world, how they start to value different things. So, you know, say in 2000, a collector might have wanted a Patek 1518 perpetual calendar chronograph, and they didn't care if it was redialed. They just wanted it to look clean and nice. And nowadays, dealers and such have taught collectors to emphasize originality and condition above things like looking pretty. And it's interesting to see how you can trace some of the complicated Patek 1518s or 2499s and stuff like that, and see how they're selling for the same prices today as they were 20 or 30 years ago, because the way that collectors value certain attributes of watches has just changed. And sort of in parallel with that, obviously, we've seen all kinds of other watches just boom in price over the past few years. You know, the Journes of the world, even, you know, simple dressy Cartiers have hit $1 million in the past year. So it's, I don't know, I find it interesting from like I said, I'm not, nor will I probably ever be collecting $1 million watches. So I just find it interesting to study these things from I don't want to call it an anthropological perspective. That sounds a little too intelligent for what it is, but it's just interesting to observe how patterns of behavior and collecting have changed over the past 30 years, because it's really, compared to other collecting markets, it's not that old still. So it's interesting to see how it's evolved.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating kind of insight, right? You know, $1 million watches is a pretty new concept, and what was, you know, hitting 7 figures back then versus now, it's just, you know, it could be a steel Patek or something. It's nothing too special. Even mass-produced watches going crazy. But what I want to ask you about is, you know, you got this legal background. I've noticed it come through in recent articles. But I want to know what, like, the legal skills are bringing to your work, and I'm sure they've been doing it for a while now. But, you know, aside from digging out old patents to talk about, what are you noticing that your background in the law brings to watches?
I don't know if anything particularly substantive. Someone I was talking to the other day said they could tell I write like a lawyer, which I kind of took as an insult, but they promised it was a compliment. So I don't know. I think I always enjoyed, you know, Jeff Stein from On the Dash, and, you know, kind of the prolific Hoyer guy. He was an attorney and kind of always did On the Dash as his passion project on the side. And I always liked the way that he would lay out things in a very logical, clean way. And he was always very objective about things. I probably have a little bit more voice or perspective injected into my articles just because of the platforms I'm on. But I always enjoyed the way he wrote, and I always felt like I related to it because I was an attorney as well, and a corporate attorney like him in a way. So I don't know if that's what they meant, the way you kind of read this an article about $1 million watches or collecting the Patek 5711 or whatever it is, and there's a certain logical flow to it, the way that there would be in a legal memo or something like that. But for the most part, I feel like I am fighting against a lot of the writing impulses that I have to inject legalese or other overly complicated or convoluted sentences or words or other things like that to make my stuff more fun to read. You know, I started writing about watches because it was a creative writing endeavor and something totally different than the contracts or memos I was writing about on a day-to-day basis. And I feel like you know, hopefully I shed any impulses I used to have, you know, in legal writing in my new career.
So
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. And I mean, I was hoping you'd share some libel stories. You know, they bring you the angry letters from some of these Swiss brands. But No, I think you're a little
None
bit
yet.
less
I'm working
litigious.
on it.
That's when you found your voice, when you start getting angry letters. But you did mention earlier you went out to Rolex. You had the exclusive on the new Rolex Deep Sea Challenge, which is pretty big because that must have been right when you started, if not just before you kind of officially started working. What was that like? I mean, we can talk about the watch in a second, but what was that sort of, baptism of fire like?
It was great. Yeah, it was about a month into my starting at Hodinkee, and the call came probably 3 days before that I was going to be flying literally to and from Geneva, and I was there for probably less than 24 hours, and we had a 2-hour meeting with Rolex and their PR and their head of R&D, which was pretty cool to talk about the new watch. And it ended up being kind of the ridiculous titanium deep sea that everyone's seen and has an opinion on at this point, but it was cool to obviously see the watch in person and put it on. I have some tiny wrists, and I was joking with James Stacy beforehand, who took the photographs for the piece, that, with my luck, he was saying the only thing he really needed me for photography was wrist shots, and I was joking about how bad they would look if they released kind of a large sports watch on my tiny wrists. And of course, that's, I couldn't have even fathomed what would eventually come. But the other thing they did was they showed us around their production facilities for a little bit, and that was really cool too. It kind of feels like you're walking into a Rolex watch in a way, if that makes sense. Like, it's just it's clean and polished surfaces everywhere, and steel and aluminum and all of these things. And kind of like Rolex, the brand itself, you're not really sure what's, where the sort of precision Swiss engineering begins and where the marketing ends. It's all just this kind of seamless, beautiful lab where they assemble their watches and do some of the final testing in Geneva. And it's really cool to see a little bit of behind the scenes of the brand, I suppose. And, obviously to do that around such a funny release was cool.
Yeah, I mean, and on the release, so we're talking, what is it, 75 mil diameter, 200 mil thickness. What's your take on this watch? I mean, as someone who knows the vintage market and the history of Rolex quite well, I imagine this came as a bit of a surprise, and as you kind of already alluded to, it was you weren't expecting to be modeling, this watch. But what's your take on the Deep Sea Challenge and I guess its place in the market?
Total surprise. Well, we thought titanium because of the prototypes that had been floating around, but that was a Yachtmaster, a fairly, commercial watch. It's interesting from a sort of engineering perspective that they were able to build a wristwatch that goes to the literal bottom of the ocean. We saw the Omega Ultra Deep just earlier this year, and it's a big watch too, and it goes to 6,000 meters deep, which is half of the the Deep Sea Challenge, I should say. So it's pretty impressive what they've been able to do from that perspective. But that's talking about it more from a manufacturing or an engineering perspective than from an actual watchmaking or consumer product perspective, right? I don't think there's going to be a long wait list for a $26,000 watch that's 50 millimeters in diameter and 26 millimeters thick. It's cool as a thought experiment, but in actuality, like, I think, as with many Rolex things, the most exciting thing for a lot of people will probably be, okay, this is the release, but what can we pick at from here and prognosticate about what might be next, right? The titanium and vintage nerds are getting into the chamfered lugs are back, and all of these little details. And so, who knows? Your guess is as good as mine, is as good as the next person's, but we'll see.
We'll see. My favorite thing about that watch is, the water resistance, and no one can actually test it. Do you know what I mean? Like, who's going to buy that watch and actually? They could just say, "Oh, yeah, it's yeah, we
Speak
promise
for yourself,
12,000
Andy.
meters."
Yeah, I've got a dive schedule this weekend.
You got plans for the weekend?
Yeah,
James, James Cameron, he's already done it. Like, who else is ever going to find the?
Me and James Cameron are going to the bottom of the Mariana Trench this weekend. We'll let you know how it goes.
It's like the absolute deepest point. Like, there is no point having that race anymore because
it's the last 34 meters it'll get you.
Well,
That's
That's
there's no
true.
point.
Yeah, right. It's kind of like, we were kind of thinking it's like the thinness wars, right? Where everything gets a little bit thinner and thinner, but it's gonna you can always shave off another 0.01 millimeters or whatever. To Felix's point, I suppose there's another 34 millimeters left or meters left. So I guess there is a little bit to go, but you know, uh, the deepness wars, unlike the thinness wars, have to end. There's a logical endpoint.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
guess I on some level look forward to that. I mean, the Ultra Deep and the Deep Sea Challenge are cool watches, but I'm more interested in the stuff that I might actually buy from them at the end of the day, to be honest with you.
I don't know who. I don't know if we talked about this. I know we talked about it offline, Andy, but someone pointed out. I think it might have been the frequently referenced Chris Hall. The Bell and Ross Hydromax had an 11,000 meter rated quartz watch back in like.
That's right. Yeah, it was quartz, right?
Yeah, oil filled.
Yeah.
Like,
that's right.
Yeah, why aren't we talking about that? Anyway, that's speaking about.
I mean, we all know why we're not talking about it. It's not Rolex, man. Come on.
It's quartz. It's it's not cool. Speaking about cool, what do you think is exciting in watches? Like, what is, what stories are you like wanting to write about or like pitching for, or like what sort of areas are you really digging into?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the areas I staked out in Rescapement in early days was like Cartier vintage and CP Cartier. I kind of feel like I don't know. What do you guys? I feel like Cartier's peaked at this point. There were, looking around the auctions from Geneva, Hong Kong, New York, there were 10, 15 Cartier crashes. And 2 years ago, it was exciting to see a Cartier crash at auction. And now it's like, oh, okay, we've got another one. So I feel like Cartier is peaking. And I think what's left over from that is I just want more weird watches to cover. Felix, I know you've written about Icopod for Wrist Check before, and I've written about them for A Collected Man. Probably by the time this comes out, I'll have published an article with Hodinkee. I was able to interview Mark Newson about sort of the history of Icopod, and obviously a brand close to many Australians' hearts, I'm sure. But I was able to interview him about sort of the original Icopod, and it's something he's not really talked about since it shut down the last time 10 years ago. So, it's one example of this kind of totally weird brand with totally weirdly shaped watches that aren't like anything else out there. And I would like to continue to do stuff like that. TBD on specific things like that. I also think, in the way things are cyclical, there are certain trends from while I think Cartier has peaked, I think, the weird watches from Cartier are something that we've come to love. The other thing is they're dressy watches, right? And I think we were so into sports and hype watches the past few years. I would like to get back to giving some cool dress watches attention, vintage dress watches, precious metal dress watches, stuff like that. I think those are more deserving of attention and are probably underappreciated in the market and by some collectors at least. So sort of a steer back towards that. But that's that's probably what was more popular in the early 2010s. If I had to sort of look back at the history of watches, and everything's cyclical in a way, but every time something does come into fashion, we discover new things we didn't discover the last time around, and I think that's also what's exciting, I suppose.
I'd be really interested in your take on this. Actually, this is something that Andy and I discuss a lot. We occasionally talk about it on the podcast. We certainly talk about it in our Discord, which everyone should join. Franck Muller. We for the longest time.
I'm so glad you brought this up. Yes, you guys. Okay. Yes, I would love to hear your thoughts, but yes, please go.
For the longest time, sort of, out there in the wilderness of the watches, they were not cool, like they'd had their moment in the 90s and 2000s, and we sort of, as a thought experiment, like, could you rehabilitate the brand? Like, what would you do? And it seems to be happening. Perhaps, like, they've got some cool collaborations. They've just done the Grail Watch series with Waco. What do you think? Is Franck coming back?
I don't know. It's so weird. Like, literally, I was talking to some people like this, and I was like, all of a sudden, we need to care about Franck Muller, and I was like, literally, the article title I had in my brain was like, oh shoot, do I need to care about Franck Muller now? Like, it's something I hadn't thought a ton about, right? Like, it's something I hadn't thought a ton about, right? A Collected Man has sold a handful of kind of those early chronographs that Waco and Revolution or Grail watches limited editions are based on. And it was like, yes, they'd sold a few of them, but I didn't realize we were at kind of the point in the hype cycle where we needed to be re-releasing them already. I hadn't even kind of gotten around to thinking about them in a serious way. He's a really interesting watchmaker, and I think there's a lot there, and just like the history of the man himself to be discovered. In addition to the rise and fall, and maybe now the rise again of his watchmaking prowess. Most of it predates me, so it's like I need to talk to people to understand more about all of that type of stuff. But like, yeah, it's, if you see some of his school watches, they're really cool. Or the early Rolex that he modified that Jay-Z's been seen wearing. Like, yeah, that's objectively cool stuff. As are some of these beautiful early chronographs that he made in super limited editions that they're kind of reproducing now. But I don't know. Do you guys think it feels? This is what I think about so many trends and stuff. Like, does it feel manufactured in a way that, okay, here's what happened? A dealer or a few dealers uh, sold a few of the vintage watches from the brand, and then all of a sudden we're re-releasing it, and now we're off and running, and everyone loves Franck Muller. Like, I don't know if that's authentic or not. I understand that's how a lot of these trends work. That's kind of how the Cartier trend of the last few years worked. But I am very wary of like making sure that if I am interested in something, or going to be writing about something, that it's authentic in a way, and I'm at least like posing the inquiry and trying to understand where the actual interest in this stuff is coming from, and it's coming from somewhere that's at least a little bit pure and not totally commercially driven. I mean, obviously all of this stuff is commercially driven. Everyone's trying to sell watches, but I like to at least understand that there's a little bit of purity in any trend I might be hopping on.
Yeah, it's not like it's a brand that's been, for the last 20, 15 years or 10 years at the very least, been sitting there doing great stuff and people aren't really noticing. And it's like, oh, yeah, guys, like no one's giving this brand the love. Like, let's, we need to highlight this. It's been very much, oh, they did some great stuff in the 90s. They got caught up in a bunch of controversy and then more controversy, and then they became uncool and no one's really writing about them, and probably for valid reasons. And then it's sort of like, let's leverage that old pedigree from 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, to then try and sell more watches today. But I just think it's such a hard sell. Like, I just don't see the tide changing on modern Franck Muller.
I will say, in Frank's defense, one, it will be appealing for a commercial entity, because you can get those watches for cheap right now and get great examples for cheap. Profit margin potential is huge. I think more broadly in fashion and style, we're coming around to that moment again when Franks were cool. Like, we're talking, 90s, late 90s, early noughties fashion is becoming more present with the cool kids. Baffleck are back together. So master bankers, get in on them early. They're going to be trending up. Like, yeah, I agree with what you're both saying about, from a connoisseur point of view and from a market point of view, is that the case? But from a style point of view, I can see cool kids that don't care about watches in a few years' time going, oh, these cool crazy hours, where can I get one? Like a vintage crazy hours.
Yeah, no, there's some truth to that. Someone I spoke to about Icopod at one of the auction houses chalked up some of the success to exactly what you're saying, right? 90s nostalgia and how that's in everywhere. And the Gen Zs of the world, like, they want to dress like kids were in the 90s. So there's probably some truth from a style perspective of that being the case.
Yeah, I guess prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Laugh at me with your collection of Franck Mullers that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And it might be like, maybe it's, maybe we're a little bit too old, and maybe it'll be the next generation of collectors that'll be like, oh yeah, Franck Muller is so sick, and the style is awesome, and all of that type of stuff. And it'll just be something that me as a millennial, I'll never get it. I'm totally comfortable with the fact that I'm going to be too old to understand some things at this point in my
Add
life.
it to the list. Add it to the list of us, 30-year-olds.
Totally.
Just don't
But also,
understand.
everything else is tapped out. Like, if you want to get into serious vintage collecting, you can't afford it in so many ways. So
Totally. Yeah. So on some level, I am all for people, like, that's what neo vintage is all about, right? A totally made up word so that people can, start buying and collecting these watches from the 80s and 90s that a few years ago no one really cared much about, because, like, yeah, you can buy a 90s sub for a lot less than some 4-digit sub. So yeah, I'm totally into people discovering new areas of affordable stuff when they can't afford what used to be cool.
Yeah, it makes sense. So that's one of our predictions. What's happening next for you, Tony? What can we look forward to over the next sort of 6 months with Anthony Traina?
In terms of what I'm going to be writing about at Hodinkee,
Yeah, give us some leaks.
some leaks. Yeah, I mean, I kind of tipped you off there. I want to write more about dress watches and weird watches, and I wrote about asymmetrical watches. These, I don't know if you guys have seen these Dali watches that are kind of like knockoff Cartier crashes,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
wrote about those in the Hodinkee magazine, and I want to find more stuff like that. At the same time, I want to go deep on we do a series called Reference Points at Hodinkee, and I would love to do maybe something deep on the Patek Philippe Calatrava. I don't think that's something that Hodinkee has studied in a serious enough way, and I would like to lead the charge on something like that, maybe, and give sort of one of the most iconic or enduring model lines the real deep dive treatment, the way we've done for a lot of Rolex sport models. I think that would be fun. Auction coverage, of course, and a lot of that type of stuff. But beyond that, we'll see. We'll see. I'm always kicking around ideas. Felix gave me one earlier. So if you guys think there's anything worth covering, you guys, Felix and Andy, as well as the many listeners, feel free to hit me up in the DMs.
Nice. Crowdsourced content is the way of the future. Is there a chance we'll see you in Geneva? Could we catch up at Watches and Wonders, maybe?
I assume I'll be at Watches and Wonders. Yeah, are you guys gonna finally escape Australia and make it this March?
Break out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I assume I'll be there.
Yeah, well, we'll have to do a live podcast, class of 2022 recording. I don't know what I'm talking about. Tony, we end, as a regular listener, we end by asking a non-watch related recommendation. So what have you been enjoying out in the real world?
Yeah, I wasn't able to, the previous few years when I was doing watches in my spare time, I didn't read a lot of books, to be honest. Probably lost some brain cells because of it, but I've started reading again. The last book I finished it's called Pappyland. It's by Wright Thompson, who's kind of a known American writer. He writes about sports a lot, but he wrote about Pappy Van Winkle, which is kind of a famous bourbon coming out of Kentucky. I had kind of known the story. I'm not even a whiskey drinker, but if you're into sort of things that are handmade or well-made or made the old-fashioned way, it's an interesting read, and kind of the overlaps with watchmaking and watches present themselves. So even as a guy that's not into bourbon or whiskey, I thought it was a really fun read. And Wright Thompson is a great writer, and he's got a lot of personal touches or flourishes in the book that made it a fun read too. And I tore through it in literally a weekend. It's only a few hundred pages. So would recommend for anyone that's even remotely interested in that world, or not.
Did they touch on the sort of the fraud, the theft?
I can't remember the fraud or the theft. Like, what do you mean? What's been happening in that part of the world?
Oh, there was a massive heist from the Pappy.
Wait, seriously? How recently was this?
I think it was maybe 10 years ago, but there was a really big heist. It was like $6 million of the Pappy, because there's I can't remember what it's called, but it's like $1,000 a bottle, and it was reselling for like several thousand. So
yeah, sure.
Some of the employees were stealing it and kind of selling it, and they stole like $6 million worth or something. And then I think nearly all of them got away with it. But there's a good documentary that I'll find and send to you.
I can't remember if they talk about that, because I can't remember. The story's convoluted, and because I'm not into the intricacies of like what Pappy is what, some of that's lost on me. But yeah, it's just a great story of him sort of reclaiming a brand that was associated with his family and all of that type of stuff.
It was the reserve. It was like the Pappy family reserve. It's on Netflix.
Yeah.
That's right. 2013.
I just
Really?
think we need more opportunities to use the phrase "Pappy heist."
Yeah, it was a big deal. Like it was all over. It was like national news in 2013 because no one knew like who was doing it, where it went, and then it turned out to be a couple of employees had just been like stealing a few bottles here and there and selling them off on the black market to their friends because the resale price was crazy. Like it was thousands and thousands of dollars per bottle.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
ridiculous.
Where's the documentary on the Rolex gold heist, guys?
Wow, that's talking about Franck Muller, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Before we get into potentially litigious territories, Anthony, it's been lovely chatting to you on the podcast. It's been a long time coming. I'm really glad we could make it happen. Congratulations on everything that's going on in your life right now.
Well deserved.
Where can people find you and all that sort of jazz?
Yeah, sure. I'm Tony_Traina on Instagram, and then I still have a personal website. It's tonytraina.com. So yeah, thanks for having me on again, guys. And again, keep up all the great work with the OT podcast. It's one of my favorite watch related podcasts for sure.
Thank you very much. Great to have you on, and we will talk to you soon.
Andy Green, Tony Traina, collaboration of superstars. It's exciting. It's exciting to see someone like that writing for Hodinkee. And I can't wait to see that article about Mark Newson, which might be out by the time this goes live. Who knows? Thank you, Tony. Thank you, G-Shock Australia. Thank you, Artem Straps. Thank you, Andy Green.
Thank you, Felix.
Thank you for listening.
And if you're listening on Spotify, make sure you leave a 5-star review. And if you're not, jump on and do it. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, do it there. And tell your friends. Of course, join our Discord. Leave us a hot take. We will see you guys next week.
Podcast on Instagram, emails.